Welcome to a Sandra Day O'Connor Institute Civics for Life conversation series discussion with Yuval Levin. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he also holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. The founder and editor of National Affairs, he is also a senior editor at The New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at The New York Times. He's written several books. His latest, which we'll be discussing today, is American Covenant: How the Constitution Unified Our Nation, and could again. Yuval, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yuval, I was struck by the title. Obviously, very deliberate. The word covenant. You didn't call it America's agreement. You didn't call it American laws. Covenant has this sort of deeper meaning. It almost sometimes approaches the religious. So maybe talk a little bit about the choice there and what that means in light of your book.
Well, I certainly don't mean to suggest a religious implication. I'm not of the view that the American Constitution is divine in any way. It's very much a human product, but it is more than a contract. It is more than an agreement. And in a way, in talking about the Constitution, I actually want to pinpoint the distinction between contract and covenant, where a contract is really defined by what it would take to break it. It's a set of mutual obligations. But a covenant is really defined by the relationship that it creates. And it's defined not exactly by rights and obligations as by a relation, a connection. And I think the American Constitution, understood as law, of course, but more than law, really describes the American regime in the deepest sense and ultimately describes some of the most significant ways in which we're connected together. The working title I had in mind while writing the book, which would never have worked as a title for a book, was just the word "we," the first word of the Constitution. The Constitution begins with the notion that the American people are one people, even though it sets that as a goal for itself, the unification of our society. It describes as its first purpose forming a more perfect union. That idea is not just a legal relation. It's not just about establishing relations of rights and obligations. It really is about describing a people. And I think thinking about the Constitution, especially as we've lived under it now for 235 years, is really thinking about the nature of American society. And there's something about it that is more like a covenant than a simple agreement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess then that raises the question, thinking about the nature of American society, what is it that led you to write this book at this moment? Was it a natural outgrowth of research you had done previous? Did you feel like there was a need at this particular time for this book?
Yeah, really, in some ways, why now is the easy question. So we're living in a time of intense division, polarization, a sense among many Americans that our society has been coming apart, or at least is intensely divided. And in a lot of ways, Americans have come to blame the Constitution for some of that division, for the sense of frustration that we feel with our political life. We feel as though the Constitution is constantly holding us back from getting what we want, standing in our way, even when we win elections. And I think that that perception is not only wrong, but it's exactly wrong. That the Constitution is actually here to facilitate more cohesion in American life, and that it actually does facilitate more cohesion. And I think it's very important to see the Constitution through that lens, through the lens of its intent to foster unity. And it offers us some very, very important and valuable tools in this divided time. It offers an idea of what unity means, and it offers a set of mechanisms for getting there, all of which I think we have tended to forget in our time. And so the book is really intended to help Americans become reacquainted with our constitutional system through the lens of our need for greater cohesion, which is a pressing need in the 21st century.
That's so interesting, Yuval, because I would think of the Constitution as deliberately setting up disagreements, but perhaps what you're
Yes.
saying is that those disagreements are in fact necessary and productive, a means by which we get to the cohesion you're talking about. You do
Absolutely.
spend a
So
lot of time in your book talking about unity and what that means.
exactly. I mean, I think that one of the things that stands out about American life in the 21st century is that the way in which we're divided means not that we've forgotten how to agree with each other, but precisely that we've forgotten how to disagree with each other. We've gotten very, very bad at disagreement, and we've closed off various venues intended for constructive disagreement. Congress doesn't work the way it should. University campuses don't really afford the kinds of opportunities for engagement and disagreement that they should. A lot of our public life consists now of closed channels in which you spend time with people you agree with, talking about people you disagree with, rather than engaging with those people. And I think starting from the implicit logic of the Constitution can help us understand what a more unified society can look like. There's an idea of unity at the heart of the Constitution, which says that unity in a free society doesn't mean thinking alike, but acting together. And the difference is massively important. Thinking alike isn't really possible. And that's the premise of the framers. James Madison makes it explicit in Federalist 10, basically says in a free society where people are free to form their own opinions, they're going to form different opinions. And you're not, anybody who's ever had any experience with a group of human beings of any size knows that what happens is disagreement. That's not the end of the road for a cohesive society. Disagreement is a fact of life, but it doesn't mean unity is impossible. Unity involves coming to some agreement about how to act more than what to think. And so naturally, the question is, if we're going to disagree, if unity doesn't mean unanimity, then how really can we act together when we don't think alike? And the American Constitution is a set of answers to that question. How can we act together when we don't think alike? The answers look like negotiation and competition and bargaining and competing power centers, divided powers. All these are ways of compelling groups of Americans that disagree with each other to nonetheless deal with each other. So yeah, there's a lot of disagreement at the core of the work of our constitutional system, but it is disagreement directed toward common action, toward facilitating competition and negotiation that ultimately is how we can act together when we don't think alike. Seeing that, I think, can help people understand that unity is much more within our reach than we imagine. It's not that we have to wait until everybody agrees with each other. That really would be impossible. And a lot of the ways in which our politicians now talk about unity have that character to them, the sense of, when we're unified, nothing can stop us, which our last three presidents have all said in their inaugural addresses. I think that's just ridiculous. That's not what unity looks like. That's a way of saying if people stop disagreeing with me, then America would be great. Well, I certainly think that if people didn't disagree with me, America would be great, but that's not going to happen. So, what is going to happen is our working through our differences through the medium of a set of institutions that are built to facilitate a kind of constructive disagreement. That's how we should think about our Constitution. It's not how we tend to think about it now. And so I think we need to become reacquainted with it.
Yeah. I suppose, you spend time in your book talking about Congress. Congress would be sort of, the where deal making is supposed to happen. Um, it's not. It's not really.
Yes.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about how the structure there has sort of not facilitated, at least today, is not seeming to facilitate what it was intended to.
That's right. Congress is the first branch for a reason, and that reason has a lot to do with the Constitution's conception of unity. Congress represents the factional diversity of the American public. The president is elected too, but the president is not expected by the framers to be representative. He's elected to be kept accountable. Congress is elected to be representative. The plurality of our society has to be represented in a plural institution. And what happens in that institution is that the representatives of the different factions of American life are channeled through the structures and mechanisms and rules and processes of Congress toward negotiation and ultimately toward accommodated legislative vehicles. They can negotiate in ways that are much harder for the people that they represent to do. And they're capable, therefore, of coming together in a way that can then be reflected back on the broader public. And the purpose of Congress is to facilitate negotiation across lines of difference. I think that's important to see because it's not how we now often think about the purpose of Congress. There's very broad agreement in American life that Congress is not working well. Very few people would say that it is. But there's actually disagreement underlying that about what function Congress is not performing. What is it not doing? I think the natural answer to that question would be it's not passing big legislation. So whatever you think is the big problem, our fiscal challenges, the environment, immigration, Congress is not acting in those areas. And that's true. But I think the underlying problem is that Congress is not facilitating cross partisan bargaining and accommodation. That's why it's not passing big legislation. But it's important to see this underlying problem because if you think the problem is we're not passing big bills, then you want Congress to be more efficient. So you want to get rid of the filibuster, you want to centralize power in the hands of leaders so that they exert some party discipline and get things done with their majority. If you think the problem is we're not facilitating bargaining across partisan lines, then you actually want Congress to be less efficient. You love the filibuster, as I do, because it's the only reason we've had any bipartisan legislation in the last 15 years. You want to decentralize power, not centralize it, so that there's a way for strange bedfellow coalitions to form. You want to strengthen the committees rather than strengthening leaders. That's the way I think about Congress. I think Congress needs to be reformed in the direction of compelling bargaining and accommodation. Because right now, bargaining and accommodation are treated by members of Congress as failures rather than as the core of their job. When the Speaker of the House reaches to the minority party to pass a budget, he gets fired by his members. That's what happened in the Republican Congress in 2023. But that's his job, right? Building a coalition to pass a budget is the role of the Speaker of the House. So I think to help members see that their fundamental purpose is to facilitate negotiation would call for some reforms of the way Congress now works, for some electoral reforms on the one hand, and I talk about changes to the party primary system, but also for some institutional reforms to strengthen committees over leaders and to facilitate bargaining across differences.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. The reform aspect. It does seem as if the incentives now are not aligned with what the Constitution would sort of prefer. My question about that is not only how do we sort of get the incentives in line, but also is this a sort of modern development? I mean, how did this come about? Why are we where we are?
Yeah, I would say the changing incentives have been a function of the growing notion, advanced at first by the progressives beginning at the end of the 19th century, but adopted, really embraced by both parties by the end of the 20th century, that the purpose of Congress is to maximize partisan efficiency,
Okay.
to allow the party that won the majority to advance its agenda on its own. The progressives made an argument for that. I think it was mistaken, but it was a coherent argument that said elections have to create accountability in the party that wins. The public said it wants something, and it should get that something, and then decide if that's still what it wants. That's kind of the logic of the parliamentary democratic systems that you see in Europe and in some of the Asian and Latin American democracies. In the parliamentary system, when you win a majority in parliament, you win all the power of government. You get to do everything you want. The American system has never worked that way. Nobody gets all the power. What you win when you win an election is a seat at the table. And what happens at the table is negotiation and bargaining. This can be very frustrating, especially when your majority is narrow. So if you just barely win a majority in Congress or a presidential election, you can't get much done. And many of our modern presidents, because in the 21st century we've really only had narrow majorities, have found themselves sitting in the Oval Office thinking, why am I talking to these people? I just beat them in the election. And the Constitution says you're talking to them because legitimate public action has to involve broad majorities, not narrow majorities. The Constitution frustrates narrow majorities in order to force them to grow. And in the 21st century, that means it frustrates everybody. Even the elections that we've treated as though they were decisive were actually quite narrow. I mean, this last election is an example of that. The Republicans have the narrowest majority in the House since we've had 50 states, a very close election. Donald Trump won 49.8% of the vote. This was a 50-50 election. But we incline to treat it as a landslide and then to say, well, why can't they just get things done? Well, the fact is, the system is built to force them to deal with the other party in order to get things done. And the loss of the desire to do that, I think, has driven a deformation of the incentives that confront members of Congress. Those incentives are now very partisan, and they point in the direction of ideological purity rather than of bargaining and accommodation. And that makes it very difficult for the system to work in the way it's intended to. So we have to think about how those incentives have come to be. Again, the primary system, which empowers the voters in each party who least want bargaining with the other party, and the centralization of power in Congress, I think both run against the grain of the Constitution.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? And maybe a bit counterintuitive. It seems as if the closeness of these splits. I guess what I'm saying is the minority in Congress is right there, right there to becoming the majority. It seems as if they feel that and I should say that I'm not just talking about the current minority. I'm talking about,
Right.
this is flip flopped. Whatever party is in the minority seems to have very little incentive to work with the majority party when it's so close, because I think the thinking seems to be we're this close to getting the majority ourselves. Why would we give the other guys a win?
Exactly.
So it's sort
I
of
think that's exactly the dynamic. It's very important to understand that what really stands out from the point of view of the history of the American party system, what stands out about the 21st century is not polarization, but deadlock.
mm,
Right? We've always had, well, almost always had a two-party system. And in a two-party system, you're going to have polarization. The two parties oppose each other. But deadlock is actually pretty unusual in the span of American history. We have generally, at any given moment, had a majority party that is working to hold together a very messy, complicated coalition, and a minority party that is working to grow its own coalition to become the majority. Both of those parties are engaged in coalition building. They're thinking about how to appeal to people who don't naturally agree with them. In the 21st century, we've now had 25 years of two minority parties. Neither one of them really functions with the kind of confidence that a majority has, and so can't quite reach across the aisle and build. They're focused on bringing out their most intensely devoted voters. And we've had a lot of shifting back and forth in this 50-50 period. Control of Congress has shifted back and forth more in the last 25 years than in any other 25-year period. And control of the presidency has shifted back and forth a fair amount. We've just had the third presidential election in a row where the party in the White House changed. That's only happened one other time in American history at the end of the 19th century, which was the only other extended 50-50 period we've had. And Francis Lee, a great political scientist at Princeton, has shown that the effect of that on Congress is exactly as you described. She wrote a book called Insecure Majorities, which says that because the minority party thinks it could win next time, it has no interest in working with the majority and giving them a win. And because the majority party thinks it could lose next time, it has no desire in giving the minority any evidence of legislative success. They each think, well, next time I need to win big and then I can act. And they just don't win big. The challenge this poses is really enormous because the psychological effect of it is to lead the two parties to mistake failure for success. They think that winning 50% plus one is what success looks like. But that is not what success looks like. That leads uh, to a lack of durable legislative and executive accomplishments. It leads to back and forth. What it would take to really win is to think, how do I get to 55%? How do I get to 60%? I do think that is achievable in 21st century America, but it would require explicitly seeking a broader coalition, which means dissatisfying your activists because they're going to vote for you anyway. They're not going to vote for the other party, and reaching out to potentially winnable voters on the other side in a big way. Our parties have gotten very bad at doing this, and therefore pretty bad at negotiating with each other, at coalition building in general. Coalition building is the essential work of American constitutionalism. And unless we see that and recover the capacity for it, it's going to be very hard for our system to function.
Interesting too, talking about the Constitution and how it set up these three branches, and they're supposed to be, I take it, in somewhat tension with each other. The idea being that their powers would limit each other. It seems to be the case where, again, the political parties have sort of smoothed that tension out. Where now, and again, it could be one party, could be the other. Where now they sort of work across branches rather than within the branch against other branches. Is that a fair reading of the evolution
Yeah,
here?
absolutely. I describe this in the book as the separation of powers being replaced by the separation of parties. And the way it displays itself, especially in the two elected branches, of course, in the Congress and the presidency, is that people come to identify their own success with the success of their party more than of their institution. And it's especially a problem because it creates a loss of institutional identity in Congress. And so members of Congress, when the president is of their party, understand themselves as kind of like staffers. They just work for the president. That's very much happening now with House Republicans. It happened with the Democrats under President Biden. They just see themselves as working to advance the president's agenda rather than understanding themselves as having their own interest institutionally that certainly has an ideological valence to it, but they are stronger when Congress is stronger. Members of Congress now tend not to think that way, and in fact, they have willfully weakened the institution. They want Congress to be weaker so that it doesn't stand in the way of the president of their party, and also, frankly, so that they are not held responsible for the big, difficult decisions. They treat themselves as though their job is to stand on the side and watch the president do his job. And so you've seen oversight come to the fore and become the central function of the minority party in Congress. And the majority party just tries to defend and advance the president's interest. The system can't really work that way. And we've seen this deformation now over a long period. Again, it's been happening throughout the 21st century. I worked at the beginning of the 2000s for George W. Bush. I was a White House staffer in his second term. And one of the things that really strikes me now in thinking back about that period is that President Bush went 6 of his 8 years in office before he vetoed a single bill. He went through 6 years without using the veto pen because there was a Republican Congress for 6 of his 8 years, Republican House. They never sent him anything that he did not approve of. The system is not meant to function that way. There needs to be tension. There needs to be back and forth so that the interests of the people within the different institutions can be balanced some. And as long as people don't identify themselves with the institution they are part of, our system is going to have trouble functioning.
Yeah. You write in the book. I should say, it comes out. You have quite the affinity for Madison,
Yes.
bromance developing here,
The
and
non lawyer framer, he speaks to me.
yeah, right. Yeah. Um, but you do note in the book that though he was very sort of perceptive about the future in a lot of ways, very sort of, that potentially when it came to partisan politics, he maybe didn't see the evolution there. Do you think that there are, I don't know if you think that's fair the way I've described it,
Yes.
or do you think that there are elements of the Constitution that had he seen the way this was going, that he may have changed things that you think could be better to sort of help us where we are now, given the political parties we have today? Curious.
Well, I think that our system has adapted to the reality of parties over time, but it is certainly striking in looking at the way the framers thought about things that they did not envision a durable party system. Um, Now, they started to build one almost immediately. Once the Constitution was ratified, and the very same people who created it had to govern within it, they started building parties. And Madison was very involved in the development of the Jeffersonian, what became the Democratic Republican Party, and ultimately the Democratic Party. Um, But to begin with, he thought the system could function without parties. And you still see the imprint of that sense in various parts of our system. The presidential selection system, I think, is the place where you see it most. And that system changed almost immediately from what it was intended to be. The Electoral College was thought of as a venue for a kind of elite deliberation about who should be president. And it almost never worked that way. From the very beginning, it functioned as a kind of rubber stamp on the popular vote in each state. And very quickly, that came to be a partisan vote in each state. The Electoral College created something of a problem for the American party system because in order to win the presidency, you have to win an absolute majority of electors. And that means that if there are more than two serious candidates for president, the election is likely to go to the House of Representatives. And that happened twice in the 19th century, created really serious legitimacy crises in both cases in 1800 and 1824. And the result was our two party system, where institutions emerged around the constitutional system to make sure that there were only two serious candidates for president almost every time. And our political parties came to see their purpose as facilitating that and ultimately as facilitating candidate selection in our system in general. The United States is very unusual for having a durable two party system. There's almost no other democracy where there are really only two meaningful political parties. And that's very much a function of the structure of the Constitution. But that system has developed itself, the party system has made itself into the kind of missing piece of the constitutional puzzle. It was not envisioned by Madison and the other framers, but I think it's helped the system fill in what it was missing. And I wouldn't say at this point that there is a problem we confront that requires a constitutional amendment. I think a lot of what we require is a kind of reacquaintance with the original logic of the Constitution. The Constitution is not the problem in this moment, but more like the solution. And I'm not of the view that there are amendments we need to make things work better.
Interesting. Um, you touched a little bit on polarization earlier, and certainly we're in a polarized time. Madison, I think Madison had was a bit suspicious of the citizenry, and I think that comes through in the design of the Constitution. Of course, so the Constitution seems to almost make an argument, so many arguments in its structure, and one of them is be suspicious
Yes.
of
Of everybody, the
of
people
everybody.
and the elites.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, um, in order, I think, for this system to function, however, there has to be, as you said, this sort of back and forth negotiation. There has to be a little bit of willingness to be selfless, to give things up. Today, we're sort of confronting a polarization that seems to be a bit different. You can tell me what you think about this. The notion of this rise in effective polarization, where not only do I believe that this person disagrees with me, I believe this person has bad intentions, is
Yeah.
kind of a bad person. So that seems to be a difference not just in degree but in kind. I wonder if there are other points in time. I mean, obviously, Pew hasn't surveyed this going back to the 1700s, but were there other points in time where the Constitution was confronted with a situation where the citizenry seemed to have be effectively polarized in this way? And if so, how did the document help us navigate that? How could it help us today in this situation?
I think we tend to underestimate the intensity of polarization at other moments. A lot of Americans lived through a period of very unusually low polarization in American life, from the end of the Second World War until just about the 1990s. There was really very unusually low polarization. There was a very unusually strong elite consensus in American society, and and parties that won elections won really big. You know, Ronald Reagan won 49 states in the Electoral College in 1984. That's very strange, and is not the norm in American political life. The norm is actually a little more like what we're living through now in terms of the intensity of polarization. Any time in the 19th century, you're looking at America, there's a kind of low level political violence, more so than we have now. There's very intense polarization. Obviously, that's the case in the Civil War decade and the lead up to it, but it's also the case in general before and after it. And so I don't think we should overestimate how calm and friendly American politics used to be. But I do think that living in a 50-50 moment creates intense affective polarization that doesn't get resolved by coalition building. So that when you have two minority parties, the main argument that each party makes to the public is that the most important thing is to prevent the other party from winning. That's really the fundamental case that both Republicans and Democrats have made to voters throughout the 21st century. The key, the most vital thing we have to do is make sure that those people don't win. And, because they'll destroy democracy, they'll bankrupt the country. And so the argument isn't really we should win because we have an agenda for the future. Our politics has remarkably little to do with the future in the last couple of decades. It is really about averting catastrophe because that is what would happen if you let those people win. That's obviously not a healthy politics, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for negotiation. You can't say these people are going to destroy democracy, they're fascists, and then just make a budget deal with them, right? It's hard. They do it, but it's a complicated thing to justify to yourself and to your voters. And both parties have put themselves in this position so that their natural inclination when they do win is to look for ways to do things on their own. We see this now, but we saw it in the Biden years too. The winning party comes in and it asks itself, how do we get the big bill passed ourselves? Republicans are thinking, how do we get, they have a 3-vote majority in the House and they want to pass a big tax bill as a reconciliation bill, a Republicans only bill. There's no reason for that. You could easily get 25 Democrats to vote for a tax bill that Donald Trump could sign, but it's just not the natural instinct that the parties come in with now. And I do think that's an enormous problem. It's partly the result of our 50-50 moment. It's partly a cause of it too. And the reason for me to focus on the Constitution is that if you think about how to break that cycle rather than what has caused that cycle, then you have to think about political culture. And that means you have to think about incentives, and that means you have to think about the purposes of the institutions.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. Let's turn. We've been talking about a lot of the problems, but you start the book. You say this book about America. It's a hopeful book.
Yes.
So you're a smart guy, obviously, and I think a lot of people want to be hopeful, and they say, "What is a smart guy like Yuval? Where is he finding this hope? Because I want to go there too." But I also want to not be, completely naive.
Yes.
Maybe a little naive about some things, but not too naive. So maybe tell us where's this hope coming from? Where do you see
Yeah.
it?
We should distinguish, hope from optimism. I'm not optimistic. I don't just think things are going to go well. That's not how the world works. I'm also not pessimistic. I don't think things are destined to go poorly for America. I'm hopeful in the sense that I think things could go well if we are up to it, if we can do the work of helping them go well. And I think the Constitution is an incredible set of tools for doing that. So, one reason I'm hopeful is that we do have this political tradition, this inherited set of institutions that offers us the tools for doing well. I'm also hopeful because a lot of Americans now are looking for a better way. There's a very widespread sense that things are not going well. That may seem like a strange source of hope, but it is a source of hope because it means that people are not satisfied with the broken status quo, so that they may be open to arguments for institutional reform and for thinking differently about the potential of our political culture. And ultimately, I'm hopeful because we're Americans, and it's not a good idea to bet against America. The United States has tremendous resources at its disposal for succeeding. And although it has a long history of letting mistakes fester, it also has a long history of eventually coming around to seeing that change is necessary. I feel like we are at the end of a phase in our political life. It's not ending well, but it is ending, right? We just had inaugurated the second president in a row who was 78 years old on his inauguration day. That is an end. That is not the beginning of the next phase. It's the end of a phase. And the question of what comes next is a question that's going to be answered by reference to Americans' frustration. It's going to be different because people are not very happy with where we are now. So I think there is cause to be hopeful if we take seriously the resources we have for change. And that's why this is a moment to be reacquainted with the Constitution, because that's one of the most important set of resources we have.
Yeah. That's interesting. We do a lot of work in civics education, and I've used this analogy before, where it's kind of like what you just said. I mean, civics education in this country is at such a low point that if it's a stock, I mean, I'm buying because it looks to me like it's got one way to go, and just what I'm seeing, the frustration and everything, that this is about the as low as we can go.
Yeah.
Um,
But I think you say a little naive, and I agree with that. I think reformers, to be successful, have to be, you might say, they have to have a kind of strategic naivete.
sure.
You can't just be a cold-eyed realist about the things you really love in life. You're not a cold-eyed realist about your kids or your closest friends. You're a little naive about them. You think, wow, they could really go somewhere. And yeah, they could. And I think we have to think that way about our country, because ultimately successful reform efforts are always implausible at the outset. And it's because you believe that they could work even though at the moment nothing is working, that ultimately you get to a place where they're actually practically achievable.
Um, Yuval, I'd like to close talking a little bit about, you had mentioned your working title for the book was "We," and you're a naturalized citizen, and there's a story. Well, maybe tell us a little bit about that. I mean, that's where the
Yeah,
"We" comes from, right? Is this
that's right.
okay? Do you want to tell that story? I think people would really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's right. It's a peculiar story that came to mind over and over as I was thinking about this book. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Israel. My family came here when I was a young child. I was 8 years old. So I grew up here, but I became an American citizen when I was 19. I was a college student, and I took the oath at the federal courthouse in Newark, New Jersey. This is in 1996, and the judge who delivered the oath then got up to give a little speech. And I thought, so by this point, I'm 19. I'm a college student studying political science. I'm already a history buff, a patriotic history buff, and I think he's going to quote Lincoln. He's going to talk about James Madison. He didn't do any of that. He gave a very short talk, and the core of it was, he said, from now on, you have to think about America in the first person plural. And I didn't know what he meant, and I think a lot of us new immigrants were very glad that new citizens were very glad that it wasn't on the test we just took. But he explained it. He said what he meant was, we have to think and talk about America in terms of us and we, not them and they. There, immigrants do tend to talk about America as them, um, and to see it instead as we was absolutely crucial. He thought, for having the right attitude as an American. I honestly thought at the time, I was disappointed with the speech. I thought, this is a strange thing to say, but here I am, decades later, still talking about it, because in fact it was exactly what we needed to hear, and not just what we immigrants needed to hear, but what we Americans need to hear. That it's essential that we think about our country as something that belongs to all of us, and "we" is the first word of the Constitution. It's the first word of that incredible second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self evident. These are documents that speak in the first person plural, because they speak on behalf of a people committed to a common fate. That is who we are. And it's very important that we not forget that in divisive moments like the one we're living through.
Yeah, well said. Thanks, Yuval. The book is American Covenant. Yuval, thanks for so much for doing the work to write it. It's absolutely terrific.
Thank you very
And
much.
yeah, and thanks for spending some time to talk with us today about it.